Hello everyone, myself Vinay Kumar. Welcome to my YouTube channel. In this YouTube channel, I will be teaching physics, chemistry and mathematics starting from 8th standard till 12th standard. If you want to learn physics, chemistry and mathematics, then please do subscribe to my channel. In the last video, I was actually explaining about force and pressure, which is the 8th chapter of science subject. So in this particular video, I will be explaining the 9th chapter of same 8th standard subject, which is friction. So while explaining contact force in the previous chapter itself, I have explained what is friction, because friction is also a form of force which comes into picture only when two particular objects come into contact. So hence friction is also known as contact force. These things I have explained in the previous video, so you can actually watch the previous video on force and pressure as well. So in this chapter we will be dealing with friction in detail. So to understand friction, we will take an example of a banana peel. So if a person is actually walking on the road, suddenly if a banana peel or some oily kind of substance is actually spilled on this particular road, then this person while walking on this particular path, he will actually slip over this oil spilled area, or he will slip over the banana peel. Why? Because the friction which was supporting this person to walk on this particular road has actually reduced, because oil and banana peel are so soft in nature that they reduce the friction which is there on that particular surface. When this person was actually walking on this particular road, the friction of this particular road was supporting the sole of his slippers. Now that friction has actually reduced because the sole of this person's shoes have been placed on a banana peel or an oil spilled area. So now because the friction has reduced, so this person will not get balance properly to walk on this floor and he might fall on this particular road. So this shows even while walking, the friction is very important for us. Let us take another example as well. If we have a blackboard or a whiteboard, and if a person is actually writing on this blackboard and writing on this whiteboard, the friction which is opposed by this particular board will be responsible for the ink to get flowed on that particular board. Because when a person writes on the board, necessary amount of friction is actually given by that board, and it will be responsible for the ink or the dust of chalk to get stuck on that particular board, and hence we can see whatever is written on the board. So here also, to write on any surface, now I am actually writing on this digital pad. Even here the friction which is applied by this digital pad is responsible for me to write smoothly on this particular digital pad. So here also we can see that the friction is actually helping us to write properly. You might have seen when drivers apply brake to their vehicles, the vehicles actually comes to rest. So you can understand how friction plays a role in our day-to-day life. So to understand friction in our day-to-day life, you can perform an experiment in your home. You can place a book slightly slanted on a table. You can keep some towel rolled under this book so that this book gets support to be slanted on this particular table. Take a ball and roll on this particular book. So this ball will roll on this book and it will move on this table to a certain distance and it will come to rest at a particular point. So similarly, repeat the same experiment by putting a towel on this particular table where the ball was actually moving. So now if you roll the ball on this particular book, the ball will travel till the end of this book and it will travel a little distance on towel, and this ball comes to rest at a particular point on the towel. So if you compare the distance covered by this ball from the end of this book till the point where it has come to rest, you can see there is a lot of reduction in the distance. That means when towel was kept on this particular table, ball actually traveled to a smaller distance. But when there was no towel on the table, ball actually moved to a larger distance. Why? Because so now you might be worrying why ball traveled more distance on an empty table and why ball has traveled less distance on the table where towel was placed. Why? Because the surface of the table was smooth enough to give very less friction for the ball to come to rest. But when you placed towel on this particular table, it actually reduced the smoothness of this particular table, and hence when smoothness of this table has reduced due to the towel placed on this particular table, the ball comes to rest within a shorter distance. That shows towel is actually putting more friction for this ball. So whenever an object is traveling on a particular surface, the surface to which this particular object is in contact with will apply friction for this object. Hence the object motion will cease after this object covers a certain distance. That shows actually friction is playing a major role in our day-to-day life. Now you might be wondering what is the reason for the friction to act in between two objects. So when you actually touch the objects, you can feel some smoothness and roughness on these particular objects. So if you consider a table, if you see the table has a very smooth surface. But when you actually place a microscope on this particular table, and if you watch on this table through this microscope, you can see there will be lot of irregularities on this particular table which you cannot feel by your hands and which you cannot even see through your naked eyes. So there will be lot of irregularities on this particular table. This you can observe only through certain microscopes. When you touch the surface of this table, you might feel that the surface of this table is smooth, and even when you see the table, you might feel that the surface of this table is actually smooth. But only when you look this table through a microscope, then only you can observe there is lot of irregularities on this particular table. Similarly, if you keep a book on this particular table, even the bottom surface of this book also might be smoother to your hands, and you can also feel the smoothness of the bottom surface of this book. But only when you see through a microscope, even this book's bottom surface will also have lot of irregularities. So the irregularities of one object and the irregularities of other object will actually apply force on each other, and hence the frictional force will be developed in between these two objects. So this shows that one object is applying frictional force to the other object, and this particular object will apply the friction to this particular object. Why? Because there is lot of irregularities present between these two particular objects. So that's why if you keep a book on a particular table, the book will never slide to any of its ends, because the irregularities of the surface of this book and the table has locked each other. So this locked irregularities will actually keep this book stable. So here actually frictional force is acting in between these two objects. By looking at these examples, we may think friction is acting like a friend and it is also acting like an enemy in so many other cases. So whenever we walk on a floor, whenever we keep objects on a particular table, whenever we do so many other works in our day-to-day life, actually friction is supporting us to do the work. So in some cases, friction is actually turning to be an enemy for our work to be done. Because if we take an example of moving a very heavy object on a particular surface, it will be really hard to move this object. Why? Because the object has lot of mass, hence it applies lot of weight on the surface. When the irregularities of this particular object and the irregularities of this particular surface on which this object is kept, hence friction is acting in between these two objects, and this object has lot of mass which has applied lot of weight on this particular surface. So this actually increases the friction in between these two objects. Because the mass of this object is very high, hence it applies lot of weight on the surface, and hence frictional force becomes more and more stronger because there is lot of mass in this particular object. Hence at this particular point, friction becomes an evil to move this object from this place to another place. So at that particular time, to overcome the friction which is holding this object to this surface, we have to apply lot of force. We have to spend lot of energy to apply lot of force to this object so that we can move this object in a particular direction which we desiring. So in this particular case, you can see that friction is actually becoming an enemy for our work. Even sometimes you might have been observed that the shoes and slippers which you are actually wearing will get teared after a certain particular point. The sole of this particular shoes and slipper will be torn. Why? Because after using this slipper and shoes for a longer time, because of the friction which was generated in between this slipper or shoes with the land surface, it actually generated heat in between these two particular objects. Because of this, the sole of slipper and the sole of shoes, due to this frictional force, has got damaged over a period of time. So in this case, the damage occurred to this shoes or slippers is due to frictional force. And here also friction is acting as an enemy. But while walking, we want friction, because without friction we cannot walk properly on the surface. So that's why friction helps us to walk, but at the same time friction damages our shoes and slippers. Even the tires of vehicles will get damaged over a period of time due to friction, because when these tires actually travel on the road, because of the friction which is offered by this road on this particular tire, will actually damage this tire due to lot of heat generated due to the frictional force. Even while playing carom, you might have seen pawns which you are hitting at a particular force will not be enough for this pawn to move towards the hole. You will actually apply some kind of powder on this particular board so that you can reduce the friction which was there on this board, so that pawn can easily move towards the hole and you can actually hit that pawn properly. And even sometimes friction which is generated inside the engine will also damage the engine. That's why people use engine oil inside an engine to reduce the friction inside the engine. Even you might have seen that in most of the engines and in most of the vehicle construction, they will use lot of ball bearings. Why? Because when you use ball bearings in between any junction, then the friction occurring in between those two objects will be reduced. If you consider this as one particular object in a particular machine, and this is another object which is placed in that particular machine, when they are constantly in contact, they actually generate friction in between. To avoid friction in between these two objects, certain ball bearings will be inserted between these two objects, so that this ball bearings can actually avoid friction in between these two objects, so that we can actually enhance the lifetime of this particular objects. So if we want to enhance the lifetime of a particular machinery items, then we have to use certain amount of oil which is actually good for those machines, and we should use ball bearings in that particular machine so that it can minimize the friction which is actually generated in that particular machine, and hence the lifetime of that particular machine will be enhanced. So now let us discuss one more case. If you have a table like this, if you place a particular object on this table, then the irregularities of first object is actually getting locked with the irregularities of the table surface. So that shows the frictional force is acting in between the irregularities of these two objects and locking these two objects to be stable in one particular position. But now if I use a lubricant in between these two objects, then that particular lubricant, which is actually a liquid, will go and sit in that particular irregularities and actually reduces the irregularities of that particular object, and it will actually reduce the irregularities of the surface as well. The oily liquid which was applied on the table surface actually covered the irregularities of this particular table surface, and it has also covered the irregularities of the object surface. Hence the frictional force which was generated between these two objects, that is between this object and table, has actually got reduced, and hence this object can smoothly move on this particular table. Just because you are using some lubricant, just because you are using some oil, it actually reduces the frictional force in between two objects, because this oil or this lubricant actually fills up in this particular irregularities and it avoids the irregularities which was previously existing on the table and on the object surface. So now because the irregularities has got reduced, because that irregularities has got filled with lubricant oil, hence the object will easily move on that particular surface with less friction. This shows using some lubricants or oil will actually reduce the friction which is actually developed in between two objects. So now if you want to move any object on a particular surface, you can use some lubricants which is actually advisable to use for those two particular objects without any hassle. Then you have to use some lubricants or you have to use some oil so that you can reduce the friction and you can easily move the object on that particular surface, provided that you should actually see that particular oil and that particular lubricant is best suited for those objects. You might have seen that for a heavy suitcase there will be wheels provided at the bottom so that you can easily move this heavy suitcase on road. Because when you provide a wheel for a particular luggage, then this wheel actually reduces the frictional force which might have been developed between the suitcase and the land. So now the wheel has reduced that friction, and hence this suitcase can be easily moved on this ground because of these wheels. Hence here also you can see that a circular object is actually responsible for reducing the friction. Even in engines also you are using ball bearings which are circular in nature. Hence the wheels also reduce the friction, and also ball bearings reduce the friction, and also oils, lubricants also reduce the friction. Actually, to move one particular object on another particular object, we actually use rolling motion by using a wheel. Even when we use wheel for object to roll on another object, still there will be a certain amount of friction which is actually applied on this particular rolling motion as well. So the friction which is applied on this rolling motion is known as rolling friction. So whenever one object is actually rolling on another object, the rolling motion of that particular object, when it is restricted by a certain amount of friction, then that friction is actually known as rolling friction. Whenever you slide an object on another object, the friction applied on this object due to this object is actually known as sliding friction, because you are actually sliding this particular object on this particular object, and friction is actually generated in between these two objects. So such kind of friction which is actually coming into picture when you slide one object on another object is known as sliding friction. The friction which comes into picture when you roll one particular object on the other object is actually known as rolling friction. So you can see here, use of wheels actually reduce the friction, but still there will be some amount of friction which acts on this wheel. So you cannot make this friction come to zero, because even if you use wheels, even if you use ball bearings, even if you use oils and lubricants, still there will be a small amount of friction. So you cannot overcome that particular friction. You might be wondering that only solid objects will apply friction. No, actually liquids also apply friction, and even air molecules will also apply a certain amount of friction. So whenever a bird or an aeroplane is actually flying in the sky, actually the air molecules which are there around this particular aeroplane or bird will actually apply a small amount of friction on this particular object, and hence it reduces certain amount of speed of this particular object. So here also air is actually applying the friction. Hence the aerodynamics of a particular aeroplane is in such a way where its front part is very sharp, so that it can easily overcome the friction which is applied by this particular air molecules. Even you might have seen some bullet trains which have their front part actually designed in a particular way like this, because when you have a sharp end in front of this vehicle, it actually reduces the friction of air molecules. Hence this object or this particular bullet train can get maximum speed. So this shows even air molecules actually apply friction. Even liquids apply friction. To understand this, we can take an oil inside a particular container, and if you place a metal ball on this particular oil, this metal ball will reach to a certain velocity, and then it reduces its velocity. It goes in a certain constant velocity and slowly it touches the ground. Here actually the oil is more viscous fluid and water is less viscous fluid. You will study about viscosity in your higher classes and understand that more viscous liquid apply more friction to the objects which is kept inside that particular liquid. So this shows even liquids actually exerts friction on an object which is kept inside that. So the frictional force which is actually applied by the liquids is actually known as drag. You might have seen walking inside a swimming pool is very difficult. When you walk on an empty land, there will be a lot of air molecules which apply less friction to you, hence it will be easier for you to walk on a land. But when you walk inside swimming pool which is filled with water, walking inside water will apply more friction to your legs. Hence, walking inside water will be more difficult compared to walking on the land, because air molecules supply less friction and water molecules supply more friction. So, solids supply highest friction, whereas liquids supply moderate friction and air molecules or gaseous molecules apply lesser friction. So now you have learnt lot of things about frictional force, and you have also learnt about force and pressure in your previous chapter, and I have explained force and pressure in my previous video, and in this video I have actually explained what is frictional force. Like this, I will be uploading more and more videos related to physics, chemistry and mathematics explanation starting from 8th standard till 12th standard. So if you want to learn physics, chemistry and mathematics, then please subscribe to my channel and stay tuned with my channel. Thank you.